There we go.
There we
Okay,
are.
here we are. We are good to go.
Just like
Hi,
that.
everybody. Yeah, just like that. Hi, everybody. My name is Wendy Norris, and I am the president and founder of the Texas LODD Task Force. And over the last few weeks, we have been hosting a Facebook Live series called Surviving This Stress. After we realized this COVID pandemic was going to be lasting for a lot longer than we had hoped or anticipated, we realized that kind of the level of stress that first responders normally deals with was starting to kind of skyrocket, and we just saw kind of a ripple effect happening through our families personally, and then our families at our agencies that we work with. So we felt like it was an important part of our work that we try to encourage families and first responders of all kinds, fire, police, EMS, dispatchers, families of the fallen, families of the injured. And now, of course, we know that we have quite a few of our first responders that have come down with COVID and have lost their lives with the COVID virus. And so it was important for us to put a series together to just kind of encourage those individuals. And so we've had the chaplains on, we've had a spouse on from a law enforcement officer, and then we've had some really great conversations with some incredible people. But tonight, being from California and growing up in California and starting my career in the fire service in California, I had to have my California family here, which is why we have you, Dave. So
Glad to be here.
I know, I'm so glad. Thank you for coming on. I know it's dinner time where you're at, but I've known Dave for, I don't even know how long. I feel like I've known you forever.
Yeah.
I met
A
Dave.
lot of years.
I know. I met Dave through the Federation of Fire Chaplains. We're both also chaplains as well. And so we've known each other for a long, long time. I should have had the picture of you with Catherine on her back. She's going to be 13 tomorrow. So she definitely wouldn't ride you like a horse anymore. She's too big. But can you give us a little bit introduction about who you are and what your position is and just what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Presently I'm a station captain for San Bernardino County Fire Department at Station 78 in Fontana, which is probably very similar to I know this is a little further north than you, but comparing it to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I would say kind of like Irving in those areas. Very nice community. It's got its share of both industry and bedroom community as well. Just a nice community to live in. And actually, I grew up in Fontana for most of my life before I moved to the desert. So fire service wise, this is my 32nd year in the fire service, and it's been great. 36 years overall, both in EMS and fire. So
when do you get to retire?
What's that?
When do you get to retire?
Well, if you ask Lisa, it should have been 2 years ago.
Right.
Yeah. So we're trying to figure that out. With this COVID event, depending on how in the end it impacts the economy, we have to look at those things. It could be sooner rather than later. We're once we get back on track, I actually have an appointment that I'm supposed to follow up with for meeting for retirement talk, but that's probably 1 to 2 years out yet, realistically. So,
we have a little
but if the numbers work out, it could be tomorrow. Who knows?
True. I think John is always saying that too.
You can hear Lisa in the background's going, "Yay!"
She can poke her head in every once in a while and give a thumbs up.
Yeah, Wendy says you should poke your head in every once in a while, babe. So.
You're more than welcome to give your opinion.
Yeah.
Last week we actually had
Go ahead.
We had one of our responders for the task force. He's a fire chief for Leander Fire Department. We had him and his spouse on, and it's fascinating always hearing the spouse or the family members' opinions too. They're so important in this whole story, really. So
yeah, our spouses are the real story behind everything that we do.
For sure.
It's not possible without that. So
for sure. So what is your position again within the fire department right now?
Okay, so my regular job is that of a station captain, and I've been a chaplain now for not quite 20 years, probably 19 or 20 years now, and then I also help oversee our care team, which is our chaplain peer support program, and that's a story in and of itself. But
we may have to have you back on for that.
yeah, no, we can talk about that. That's kind of my heart and passion, and I'd love to do that. But in this particular case, about 3 years ago, we started in our department a Type 3 incident management team. And in this particular case, for the most part, we respond to various incidents, both local, and we're available even for outside the area, although we haven't really had cause for that yet. Those are handled mostly by the national and state Type 1 and Type 2 teams. But the Type 3 team, through FEMA is really interested in those programs because of the ability to take care of things at a local level, and in some cases even cost effectively. So with that, our team is relatively young. As I said, we're about 3 years into this. And so we've had the opportunity to help oversee, again, mostly local things. But when COVID came up, our chief and our deputy chief in particular, who is also the IC of our IMT, they began discussions in early March before the quarantine was in effect to look at how we're going to deal with this as it reaches our area. At that point in time, we hadn't had any reported cases in the county, and so that's where that began.
So what did it look like for you? There's a lot of similarities. I know we all like to pick on each other, so to speak, like sure. Texas likes to poke at California and California likes to poke at everybody else. We Absolutely. All do that. But there's so many similarities in what we go through as far as like emergency response. We have the nasty wildland fires out here. Now, we may not have necessarily the forestry part of it, but we have some pretty nasty wildland fires out here. Hurricanes, which cause quite a bit of devastation. And there's earthquakes out there that can wreak havoc. So we have a lot of similarities when it comes to major disasters and major crises. And usually, like if something were to happen over there, like I think one of the most recent that we can all think of is Camp Fire. As far as impacting California. And we sit back here in Texas and look at that. And, as first responders, we want to be out there during that year where it just impacted the whole state, these spot fires for California. But it's just happening in California. And so we're removed from it and we can rest from it and we can take a break for it. And we can then obsess about it again if we don't get to respond, with our deployment teams. But this is, global, and it's really just impacting everybody everywhere. I think anybody you talk to has a loss of some sort, whether it's a loss of an event or a travel or whatever job, person. It's huge. But what did it look like for you guys out in California? When did you start seeing kind of COVID coming up, and then when did it really kind of reach the crisis point in California?
Well, as you said, it's probably very similar on your end as well, and you can tell me if I'm on track with that or not. But for us, a lot of it began with discussions in the station. We watch the news just like everyone else, and of course, with any host of political opinions along with that, right?
Sure.
As it got closer and the CDC began to discuss it, and I want to say that was like in early March or so. We were talking just simply as crews how we would respond to this, and we forwarded those concerns up to our battalion chiefs, and who also took those concerns to management, and that's really kind of where the discussions began. Of course, we all have our communicable disease protocols in place, and but we even discussed on a crew level how we would deal with that, and we began to use masks more often. We began to use, just kind of ramping up a little bit on our end. And then after those questions came into the battalion that I work in, and I probably throughout the department as well, we we began to handle some things even before we had, direction from above. And it looked pretty similar. We just kind of ramped up our communicable disease protocol, and we kind of followed the TB, protocol, because that's one of the worst case scenarios we would typically deal with on a day-to-day basis. Of course, that's without a pandemic or anything else. Of course, we began to go through our supplies quite a bit. Like everyone else, like a lot of other departments, back ordering and such became a concern. We had enough for the time, but that was a real problem. And so our executive staff responded to that in early March with discussions at the direction of the fire chief to our deputy chief to perhaps look at how we were going to handle this, and our deputy chief saw that this was a great opportunity to activate the incident management team and to try and get ahead of this as opposed to, responding late in the game. And the way that looked to us is they established the command and general staff began to meet. They actually declared an incident, I want to say around the middle of March, about the same time the quarantine finally came down. The timing was actually pretty good on that.
Wow.
And I can't say that, oh, hey, we planned it that way. I don't think if you talk to anyone on the team, they would say that. It's just, when we began to recognize the need, it happened, and it happened to coincide with, the same parameters that we were getting both from the feds and the state. So actually, once we began that, we started department-wide, and it became a department effort with our team. But we quickly realized, as because nationally, that's when the concern for logistics, for PPEs, and everything else was recognized to be a problem. And I'll attribute this to our command and general staff on the team. They recognized that we probably need to go area-wide in our operational area, which is called the XBO operational area. And that includes all fire departments, all first responders, and we even reach beyond those lines to our ambulance companies, and along with our EMS authority in the area to try and we made them part of the unified, we made the EMS authority part of the unified command in this case, to try and get direction. So if we needed to change protocols, which became part of the process, we actually did that. Part of those protocols would be bringing people outside, our dispatch having the ability to give direction for people if they're able to meet us outside to minimize the contact. And those are probably similar to things that you were doing in your area as well. But, getting the jump on that like we did seemed to really help. And what was really important for our crews on, at the first responder level was having some direction, something to hang their hat on that, that we could follow. And, that went pretty well. To expand on that a little bit, it was kind of a big undertaking because our county is actually larger than I think 9 states in the nation. Wow. So we cover a large geographical area. Now, not all of that area is populated, and I know Texas can certainly relate to that.
Sure.
There actually is a lot of unpopulated area in California as well, and that. But in this case, it's a challenge we had to account for each of those agencies. So the way that we handled that was we branched our operational area off into 5 different geographical branches, and the agencies that fell within those branches, we created divisions with those. And so we were able to account for each and every agency, and what we did then is we all agreed, and as part of the unified command with the other agencies, we all agreed that we would all run our logistics for this need through one source, through the incident, so that we could get the needs distributed to each and every department, that there wouldn't be competition for that.
That's pretty amazing. I think for here in Texas, it doesn't seem quite as not well put together, but managed that way. It really comes down to the counties here and the agencies that fall within that county. And so down in Southeast Texas, since I'm closer to the Houston area, we have Harris County. They call it like a 25 county area, and each one of those counties obviously have different agencies, whether they are volunteer, combination, paid,
Right.
or law enforcement that has their volunteer police officers, or EMS, paid, nonprofit, connected to a fire department. And so it's like each county handled things their own way. So it's definitely been interesting as far as how its response has lined up in California or even in other states too. What I thought was interesting too is that we first heard about this happening in Washington State, which is obviously closer to California. It seems like that would make like a direct downward aim towards California. And then all of a sudden we heard it was happening in New York City and New Jersey. And so Texas is obviously kind of in the middle here. What did it feel scary for it to start up in Washington State? What was the thought process? Were most of the responders you find kind of like, meh?
Yeah, I think the best description of all of that was a sense of uncertainty and concern.
Mm-hmm.
If there was any comfort in it, not that I say that, any pandemic would be, I wouldn't describe it as comfort, but, when you start looking for, those measures of hope, or, instead of, giving into despair or anything like that, it was more, I think it was that when you looked at the disease itself, it seemed to attack the elderly rather harsh. And again, so there's concern along those lines. And in fact, in our own state, that proved to be the case. And well, let me say in Southern California anyway, the hardest hit COVID cases came out of nursing homes and the like, where we had a high elderly population. And of course, the complications sometimes, and of course I can't speak authoritatively on this, but from what we were hearing, a lot of it was complications related to the fact that, they were, their immune systems were down, they're fighting COVID, and, then other, their pre-existing medical conditions, came to the forefront and complicated things. So there was a lot of that. There were some area, both in Riverside and San Bernardino County, we had deputies who actually died as a result of COVID-related illnesses. And that was more early on in the process. For our department overall, we had 3 reported COVID cases. So that's, about, I want to say, 800 personnel, maybe closer to 1,000, depending on position wise, we have more individuals, but as far as, when you consider 3 cases overall now, whether that was a result of, how we were able to, get on this early, or whether or not it just, was not as significant an impact as we anticipated for, I have no idea. But I can say, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine.
I think that's what is maybe throwing everybody off, is that, New York is just being hammered with thousands of people dying. And I think most of us, even though Washington was hit really hard as well, it still feels like the rest of the country got off a little easier than New York City and New Jersey. Yeah. It's such a catastrophe. So I know that's throwing everybody off with those.
Sure. Numbers. And again, and not that I want to get into the politics of this at all. I think, if for anyone who may be familiar with the background there, there was kind of a call for New York to respond early on to, shut down certain things or to move to a quarantine status, and they didn't do that right away, and they were one of the first hit, but I think what happened there is, again, there's a lot of uncertainty about the severity of impact, and so as early as they were hit, and the reluctance to to shut things down, and I mean, you can understand it too. I mean,
Sure.
with when you shut down New York, that impacts a good portion of the country. So I'm certainly not pointing fingers at anyone, but I wouldn't want to have to be the one making those decisions either.
I know.
And but again, when you talk in Manhattan alone, and I know you've been there, Wendy, I've been there, and it's the numbers of people are just incredible. So when you the potential for contact and those kinds of things are just greater. Certainly in Texas and in California too, at least in the areas that we live in, we're not as condensed as, say, Los Angeles or San Francisco or those areas. And again, as I say all of this, it's all speculation, right?
Well, and state calls, because for a while they were daily, with the counties and the states and Department of Health and all that. I remember a few weeks ago on one of those state calls, they were talking about numbers, because they would throw out, this is what the numbers are here in Texas versus what they are here, and here, kind of the hardest hit areas. And then they wanted to show people what it was like as far as population, just to get kind of an idea. And I remember them saying that there were 68,000 people per square mile in New York City, which is like comparison to maybe 200 in Texas. So it shows you that there's this huge number of people that are there that are going to get impacted pretty quickly.
Right.
And here, I love my two favorite places is San Francisco and New York City. Huge places, but I get it, because down here in Houston, what was happening around that time was the livestock show and rodeo, which is a mega event for this area with stars that come in and sing, and a month-long really event that they prepare for all year. And that was a heart-wrenching decision for them to have to pull that, because there's all the money involved, and people's lives are dependent upon that, with just everything that goes into that. And yet that was one of the epicenters for some of the cases here in Houston area. And so sure, we can feel that trickle down. So I can't even imagine New York City or some of these other places. Right. But I want to ask you something too, because you've made responses to other disasters. You've had a lot out there as well. Wildfires, that's all I remember. Basically, whenever we would have our chaplains conference in October, we knew that you were going to be deployed to a wildland fire by the end of it. But between like the wildland fires and any of the other deployments that you've made for crisis and disasters, do you see really any differences between then and what we're seeing now, especially with your first responders that are in your department too?
Well, certainly. I think we'd all rather this, not that we would wish a major wildfire to happen, but if we have to respond to those, that's something we're familiar with, and something that we can get our head around. In this particular case, and in fact, a lot of times as the incident management team was having discussions about how we, if you think in terms of a wildfire, it's anchor, flank, and pinch, and it's kind of the same thing. How do we get an anchor around this thing and contain, the fire that it creates and where do we draw those lines, right? What is the potential spread? How does, in a wildfire, you can You can look at things and you can predict certain things because of weather, topography, all of those kinds of things.
Right.
And we really anticipated bigger numbers of our first responders to be, involved in that. And, and when in fact, in the end, whether it was due to, good PPE practices or, the guys really responded, the folks on the floor really responded well to what we had to do as an incident management team. And I think, and that doesn't always happen, on a wildfire, they're, it's because it's a little more familiar. They don't pay as much attention as, maybe they should. I'm just saying what's real, it's, so in this case, the briefings were watched, because we would carry it live, on Facebook or on, Facebook or something. We had it on a Facebook Live or something to our folks, but, and that was really helpful. But even then, and firemen are firemen, right? So what's going to happen is, like toward the end, there was less viewership and that kind of thing, because as the numbers came in, and it wasn't, what we were seeing, and hopefully that didn't translate into complacency. But I think they became familiar enough with the process that it was not quite as foreign as it was just a few weeks ago. Right.
It feels like it's different, but here, I know there's been a lot of talk. Again, when states do different things, we all point our fingers and go, I don't get it. But so we're one of those, because on Friday, the state started the phasing of opening the state back up.
Right.
So the governor is doing like a phase 1, which allowed so many businesses to open up, and with modifications and things like that, which causes a lot of controversy. There's things thinking on both sides of the fence, what we're typically seeing, or what we're really concerned about too, is the individuals that are taking their lives because they've lost everything, that they've lost their businesses or their livelihood, or family members or whatnot. And so I think there's a lot of devastation, and we talked about this before on previous episodes, that there's a lot of devastation that's occurring, and it's probably going to have fallout for such a long time. And what the impact of that looks like, death is definitely hard for sure, but we can see that, they're right. I don't know how to really put that into words. It's like it's final, it's happened, and you have to process that and deal with it, and then figure out how to rebuild your life from that. But the financial aspect and what we're seeing kind of on the level of businesses and economics, we don't know what that's going to look like. And so,
if you look back, to 9/11 and the months following that. And I think part of it is because, we as people, whatever the enemy is, whether it's terrorist related or in this case it's disease related, we want to fight and get back to normal as soon as possible. And so I think what happens is, as it did after 9/11, there were certain elements of it that you realized, okay, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be like it was.
Right.
Okay? But as we all hear, we certainly talk about this in peer support circles, the new normal, right? Whatever that looked like. When I think back to, it's interesting. You can watch old movies before 9/11, and behaviors at airports were far different than they are today.
Right.
And yet no one gives that a second thought. So are masks going to be part of the new norm for us on some level? I would say probably to some degree, yes. Do I like that? Not necessarily. And so it just speaks to some of that uncertainty. And I think you're right. We're entering a phase now where, even though the major threat is gone, just like after 9/11. I mean, there was uncertainty about other terrorists and everything, but, other terrorist attacks and those kinds of things. But also there was a greater awareness, and now I would say we're probably more ready for that than we have been, ever, before 9/11. And in this case, now that this generation And when I speak of this generation, I'm not just talking to, elderly, but all of us that are alive during this time. For the young ones, this may or may not ever happen again. It certainly has the potential to, but I know you and I haven't seen this in our lifetime.
I know.
And when I talk with, people who are well into their 80s or 90s, they haven't seen anything quite like this either. They've lived through polio and some of these other things as well. So, that says a lot about, what we've been through here.
Yeah.
And, I don't think we certainly, to try and calculate the impacts at this point, are not there. But there is going to be a need for, and just not even beyond our first responders. I think just us as a people. I know our county mental health facilities and such have seen a marked increase from people reaching out and trying to get help. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. Perhaps these people otherwise wouldn't have reached out for help if they had their normal things to keep, of coping mechanisms and those kinds of things. But when you're at home and you can't go out and you can't. Maybe for some it's hitting the bars, and they can't do that quite as readily, even though alcohol is available. It's not that same circle of friends. So
right.
Hopefully, so I think it's a double-edged sword. It can make it worse in some cases, and maybe for others, it opened up some avenues that weren't there for them before.
So what are you seeing as far as, personally, like when you, how did your wife feel about this with you being in deployment or being a first responder going out and responding to these type of things? What were you seeing family-wise for yourself, for your brothers and sisters at your station? Was there fear that was there?
Oh, certainly. Especially early on. Now I think as the numbers came in over the weeks rather than just the first few days of this, I think people had a sense that they can get through this. Yet, as far as, my own family, it's interesting because, my daughter's in healthcare.
Yeah.
And I have a niece that's staying with us. She's involved in health as well. So we had a lot of us going out, but there was also a lot of diligence because of that. The last thing we want to do is bring something home. At the same time, the last thing I want to do going into a fire station is to bring something from home into the fire station as well, because it works both ways,
Right.
So it was definitely different. I'm used to being more on guard at work than I am at home, and so yet at home, bringing those things home and those concerns, and you think of little things like, okay, do I take my shoes off? And so actually, that even translated, that kind of a mindset translated into the incident management team, because that came with instructions for our personnel on the idea was, before you go home, shower. Before you come to work, shower. All of those kinds of things. Those were recommendations that we had for our employees. Wear your civilian clothes from home to work, but don't take your work clothes home. Things that, guys had different ideas on for a long time, that changed a lot here. So yeah. If that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. So did your wife have any fear at all, or she just?
We've been through a lot over the years, and for Lisa, I think, she had concerns, but it wasn't, I think she, also a lot of that goes back to our faith too, as Christians, we're only called to do our part. And, so we were trying to make those right decisions. And I think she knew that I would do that. And of course you can't, I think, yes, there was a concern. And at one point when we were planning this for the incident management team, we felt that as much, somewhere, the numbers would be somewhere between 30 and 60% of our employees would be impacted and possibly off the workforce. So we even began to look at alternate work schedules and those kinds of things. And I don't think it was necessarily as much a fear about the disease itself as it was the fallout from that. And then perhaps, maybe we don't come home from work at all for a long time. And then we're further exposed, then we're fatigued. And fortunately, that didn't happen to the degree, that we thought it would. But it was a real concern early on.
Sure. Now, do you have you had any issues? I wouldn't say issues either. I think issues is probably a strong word. With your own first responders there, are you seeing an uptick as far as providing the peer support or the chaplaincy, or is it just kind of like you've gotten and settled in, I guess, so to speak?
I didn't really see a spike of any kind. From what our normal encounters have been. However, we did prepare for that. Our team was ready for that. And actually, and I think I shared this with you earlier, and honestly, I think it's more of a concern now than I believe it was even 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was important for us as the incident management team. We were taking the right precautions, from a physical standpoint. We're trying to minimize, fatigue, both from, encountering something that we typically don't, and doing it for weeks on end, as opposed. But in the end, one of the things we wanted to do is to realize that, we're in this for the long term. So we need to have resources in place where all of our agencies can reach out to, and not all of them have peer support or chaplain programs. So one of the things for myself, I work in the plan section in the resource unit of the team, and myself and the logistics section chief, she's also one of our leaders on the care team, and we were discussing, perhaps opening up services for agencies involved in the incident, so we had her run that up to the command and general staff, and they were responsive to it. And so all the agencies that had those programs offered their services to the incident, even to people beyond our department, which I'm sure that's often hard to do in that format. But we had 100% cooperation, and so we were able to create access to peer support services. We all canvassed our team members and offered them the ability to either participate or not. Because there may be personal reasons they don't want to do that, and that's okay. And the vast majority of them wanted to participate in the program. So we created a peer support resource that allowed them contacts through a simple QR code, and all they had to do is access the QR code to the information section. It would open up to peer support contacts for them.
So for here, of course, agencies are different all the way around, but things changed significantly for a lot of first responders in many different ways, depending on which area you serve. And so, like for law enforcement officers, they in our area could not make as many normal stops as they would, like traffic stops, or they couldn't hang out together. You always see the cop cars pulling together and talking. They weren't allowed to do that anymore. So there was a lot that they couldn't do, and it was frustrating for them. For those in the fire service that had EMS attached to it, like our agency does, you were no longer allowed to go into EMS calls. There were very few of them that you were allowed to be attached to. And if you were to go on a call that was a potential COVID, which pretty much anything respiratory was, and now of course we look at everybody as being possible. But before, I say this over and over again just because I look at it and just think it's breathtaking in a way, that our EMS brothers and sisters, that is their job. They're not fire. They're primarily EMS, is that most incidents that we go on, law enforcement will go in first, if it's a domestic assault or suicide or whatever, or if it's fire related, firefighters will go in first. It's very rare that you will see EMS go in first without somebody attached to them, just because we're there, even if we're nosy.
Right.
So it was really a struggle for a lot of us to be standing outside and sending one person in, because that was our protocol.
Yes.
One person in, and if they needed help, then you would call a second person in, depending on what the patient was. And so it's so hard for us, a lot of us, to be sitting on the outside and not feeling as if we had that person's back that was on the inside, because we all go in it together. And so there was a lot of people, including myself, that struggled with that. We felt helpless in that way. And so I don't know if you had kind of like that similar feeling of.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, I think, for us, it was especially disconcerting, especially depending on the areas you're responding to. And if you're going to a house that you've had, maybe some domestics there before and that kind of thing. But again, I think what helped with some of that is, and I don't know if you saw it in your area as much, but you know what? We hit the social media and the news really hard, getting the word out that if you call, 911, that, our dispatchers are going to be asking you to meet personnel outside and those kinds of things. And in most instances, we saw a lot of that, which even though, the additional PPEs and precautions that we would take would somehow, I don't want to say slow the call down, but add a dimension that were difficult. Some of those elements of it actually made the call a little bit easier, because at least your personnel weren't going inside. But on those instances where they had to go inside, that's where you realize that the communication part is huge. And I know, like for our crews, the idea was, as soon as you get in there, we want to know whether it's either okay for us to come in with you. If it's not, why? And, just make sure you continue to communicate with us so we know that you're okay. Because, as you're doing an assessment and you're waiting outside, you're waiting for word, it seems a lot longer than the 4 or 5 minutes it actually takes to do that.
Yeah. We feel what the patients feel now. It took forever for you to get here. Well, it was only like 4 minutes, but 4 minutes feels like 40 minutes. So yeah, we totally get that for sure. Do you see, since we're almost done, do you see this changing how you respond to future incidents, like fire disasters or earthquakes or any other type of disaster? Do you feel like this is going to change things for California first responder world?
We're talking about that, and even from an incident management team standpoint, on the federal and state levels, they're talking about how now rather than having one huge base camp, they may spread those camps out, to try and minimize contact. And they're looking at how they're going to do that. So I think we'll get a taste of that this upcoming fire season. Right. There may be a reluctance to establish base camps. And, out here in our state, hotels are used a lot, because they found that the hotels can actually be more cost effective than, ordering in the accommodations that you need for the base camps and everything. So, it may impact some of those things. It might. And then just our calls as a whole. One of the benefits that came out of this actually was something that we were talking about for a number of years, just, from the dispatch level on down, being able to use common sense and refer people to other resources. I'm hoping that we see a little bit of that on an ongoing basis, because, as you know, a good portion of our calls are calls that they don't necessarily require an ambulance or even a 911 response. But if we can defer people to the resource they actually need, I'm hoping we'll see some good like that come out of this as well.
It's been interesting down here too, how the medical healthcare has changed pretty significantly too. You would go into an emergency room on a Friday night and it was packed, like overflowing.
Yeah.
And now it's like a ghost town. They've chased everybody out. Like if you don't even fit into the criteria, they don't let you into the emergency room. It's empty. So I often wonder about that now. Is that even going to look different for emergency rooms? But
well, I think how many decades has it been now that so many of our methods for medical treatment, whether it's in the pre-hospital setting or in the hospital setting, have been based along legal concerns, right? And so maybe this has brought it back to the fact that we need to take actual medical need into consideration. And if it's great, then we need to deal with those things rapidly. And, which has become increasingly difficult when you have, numbers of non-emergent situations in the emergency room or in the pre-hospital setting. Now perhaps, we might take another look at that, because I know for us in our area, from what we've seen come in, it's not like we've done all the numbers or anything, but, from what we've been seeing, it's actually worked relatively well. And the big part of that is educating the public to what constitutes an emergency versus what constitutes something that's just urgent care or something of
an Uber ride.
Exactly. Well, and we were able to do that. That's something we've talked about for years of, maybe having the opportunity to do that. Like, we felt like perhaps our ability, our professional, training and experience, that didn't seem to count for much. And now it seems to count a little bit. And so I think, it's one of the rare things in this instance that, have been kind of encouraging, that we actually have the ability to do that. Now, whether we lose all of that, only time will tell. But, I hope that's one of the positive changes we can see out of this.
We have to joke though, because some of our medical friends or medics are like, this is the first time I can tell a patient, no, I'm not taking it. And they're loving it. They're like, nope, sorry, you're not going. You're not going to go. And they're used to not being able to say no.
Right.
So.
And when you in dark times, you always look for those little bits of light. And I think that is one of those things that have been good. And it's caused people on the receiving end to really look at, okay, am I just, why am I calling 911? So, and of course we don't want to limit anyone from calling 911 if they need help. And even if they're on the fence of things, it's call 911. It's not a problem. But for so many, I think as they come to rely on that or come to rely to go to the emergency room, because, and a lot of times too, if you think about it, even urgent cares, a lot of times their own policies dictate if a person complains of a certain thing, they refer them to the emergency room.
Right.
So even when a person does go to the urgent care. And so again, I think this has been kind of a game changer, and whether some positive things out of that, kind of work their way into the pre-hospital setting. I hope so, but only time will tell with that. So,
Sure. So last question for you. Do you feel like anything, has your perspective on anything clicked or changed, or do you feel like we're not even really out of this incident. I think we feel like we are down in Texas because the governor's opened some things back up, but I know that you guys, just based off of my parents, are still under some pretty heavy quarantine. But do you feel like anything has changed for you, your perspective, how you do the job, how you relate to other people? Do you see any changes?
Yeah, I do. I remembered, as it's interesting when this first came about, as a crew, we began to really talk about these things, not just from a standpoint of what our own opinions are, but how are we going to respond to this as a crew? Yeah. And, and so, those types of conversations, and as we began to go through that and actually implement it, and even things like this, like, you know, one of our you know, we began to discuss things like, well, who should be the guy going in? Should it be the guy with kids at home, or should it be the guy with, you know, or elderly parents at home? You know, those kinds of things you normally wouldn't think about.
Right.
And so having to work through that and realizing that those guys really care about me on that level, or I care about them on that level, you know, it's really brought our crews closer together in that regard. And the same thing could be said for our families. You know, as we spend more time at home, you know, we've rediscovered simple, you know, real FaceTime, you know, with things like board games and you know, and even for those that the family that we've been separated from because of this, you know, really how important they are to us, you know, and so and looking forward to, you know, to reuniting with them face to face, you know. So I think there's a real appreciation there. And then really even on the spiritual end, you know, I think, you know, is a reminder that, you know, this has been a reset on many levels. You know, we just talked about a few things that impact us on a day-to-day basis, but I think there's you know, the Lord's really good at trying to get our attention, and if we just pay attention.
Right. I think on the flip side for me too, when we talk about that, is also just being prepared for, even as we continue moving forward with this, we don't know what this is going to look like, whether or not we're going to see a surge or we're going to see it hit us again in the fall. But
Sure.
One of the things that I've thought about over and over again is even within the community itself and the citizens that are out there, that how being forced into isolation or quarantine is causing more, you know, child abuse or domestic violence, and that they're having to do whole campaigns on that now. And so now it's like, even on the chaplaincy end, or because first responders or in mental health, looking at what that looks like for people that don't have resources, or, you know, the kiddos that can no longer go to school and they don't have the parents that are involved in their lives. Like, now, how do we look at these things, and how do we help, and how do first responders fit into future incidents where this may occur again, and preventing some of the bad things from happening? I think this is giving us like a big picture view of the great things that are coming out of it, but then also the really bad things about it, and how can we mesh those two together to be able to alleviate some of the difficulty for some of those people.
No, you're right. In those instances, you know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that, you know, the potential for that is going to make those things even more dangerous for, you know, for persons of you know, those risk categories that you mentioned. And, you know, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, I don't know what the exact answer is on that either. And I know you're not asking it for that reason. But, you know, I haven't heard of any reports on our level for that. But that doesn't mean it's not happening, and it probably is, you know, and, you know, it's something that we really have to look at, you know, like anything else, counting the costs for those things.
Right. Well, I appreciate you being on here and answering questions. We may have to do this again in the fall after or maybe if you're coming out to Texas for our fire chaplains, we can do a live one.
Yeah, if things open up,
I know.
to do that.
I know. Well, it's funny because I'm the traveling type. I like to get out there. My friend makes fun of me all the time. She's been finding these memes about people that are, you know, flying across the airport in their suitcases because they're excited because they're traveling. And I'm like, that's me. So, but I appreciate your perspective. And I definitely want to do this again and talk more about peer and chaplaincy, and then maybe revisiting where we're at in a few months and what it looks like on both ends. But I appreciate you being here, Dave.
Well, thanks for asking me, Wendy. You know, I hope it was what you were looking for. So
definitely. Well, you be safe out there.